vermin, etc., etc. You are now looking at some of the Irish people who personally persuaded the British imperial power, after 750 years of occupation, to leave that part of their small island, which is today's Republic of Ireland. They have something to say. They hope that their words will help us to understand the Irish question.
We don't pretend to be one voice. We're one people with many voices. And there are many who have different views. But we're an ancient people who had a civilization of 1,000 years and our own laws, which were overturned.
Maire Comerford, patriot and activist for the Irish Republican Army.
The two countries started with similar populations, only about 2 or 3 million between them. But the British policy has made my country small and kept my country the only one in Europe which is denuded of population, which has, until recently, a shrinking population, while their own population has soared. And we have been retained as their servants and their suppliers of soldiers or labourers.
The circumstances of the time were that the British government, in filling its appointments here in this country, brought in people mostly from England, but from the other parts of Britain, from Scotland, Wales, and very few Irish people had a chance of getting appointments in their own country. So that education was geared mostly for export, and quite a number of the young men of my day, when they didn't go abroad, mainly went to the British colonies. Those who had lesser education, of course, went to the United States or to Canada.
Joseph Sweeney, sometime fighter for the Irish Republican Army, today a retired Major General of the Irish Army.
Would you explain to me, Seán, as fully as possible, why you felt compelled to take action against Britain all those years ago?
Well, I don't consider it so much action against Britain as action for Ireland, for the liberation of Ireland. My principal activity was on the intelligence side. And I had the good fortune to work for Michael Collins, who was our great man of that movement.
Seán Kavanagh, secret agent for the Irish Republican Army.
Can I ask you, at this stage, if you can throw your mind back, what were your personal emotions that compelled you to become an activist?
What we heard at home from our parents' tradition, father and grandfather and friends and neighbours, that tradition came down every year, every generation. And the school teachers at the time were very actively engaged in teaching history. And Irish history is a tragic history. And if you were an Irishman, just like if you were a native of any country, you love your own country. And people are prepared to make sacrifices for the right to live and to govern their own country.
John O'Sullivan, sometime fighter in the Irish Republican Army, now senior member of the Dáil, the Irish Parliament, from County Cork.
Dr. Thornton, would you please explain to me as fully as possible why you felt compelled to get rid of the British presence here in Ireland?
Because I felt they had no right or reason here. We were a separate island, and we felt we owned it, and we should own it, and no intruder or I don't know what other word to use, could or should have any act or part in it.
Brigid Thornton, a sometime activist for the Irish Republican Army, today a doctor of medicine.
I was always imbued with that spirit that England had no right whatever here, and we wanted at some stage to get them out. They were invaders, and we felt that England took up a great attitude of the dreadful doings of the Germans when they occupied Belgium. And I began to feel, and we did in school, why were they here? That there was no reason for them to have invaded Ireland and to have remained so long.
Would you tell me, Seán, how you first got involved?
The Countess Markievicz said, why should a British Boy Scout movement be organised here? to recruit Irish boys. So she formed an organisation known as Fianna Éireann, the Irish National Boy Scout Organisation. And it took very well. There was companies in the north side of the city and in the south side. John Houston was in charge in the north side. He was executed in 1916. And Con Colbert was in charge of the south side. And he was executed in 1916. But it was not until 1913, 4 years after Madam's Boy Scout movement had started, that I went to join.
Seán Harling, who joined the activists of Ireland at a very early age. Sir, would you explain to me as fully as possible why you felt compelled to take action against the British presence here in Ireland all those years ago?
Because from my very earliest childhood, I had heard both in song and story tales of the brutal oppression to which we were subjected to, both in religious bigotry and for military oppression too.
Martin Walton, a sometime gunman for the Irish Republican Army, today Ireland's leading music publisher.
So I applied for the Dublin police. My father didn't want me to leave the place at all, and he burned the papers when they came from Dublin Castle.
Why didn't he want you to join the police?
I don't really know. He didn't want me to stop at home growing up to be a vegetable. But I wanted to shake the dust of the place off my feet. I wanted to find the streets paved with gold. I'm looking for them still, by the way. So I applied to a neighbour, and I gave a neighbour's address, and the papers came down from Dublin Castle again. So I found myself on the way to Dublin for a medical examination. My father gave me £5, all the wealth he could spare. So I took off on the old slow-moving train from West Limerick, which is down the south-west of Ireland, landed in Dublin.
David Nelligan, who joined the British Dublin police, but who, in fact, was soon serving the Irish Republican Army.
So the following day I was sworn into the DMP, Dublin Police.
Colonel Nelligan is one of Ireland's most famous secret double agents.
I saw it past the orderly room, and there was a communique up, and it told of this rising in Dublin, and it told of the executions of men whose names I never had heard: Clark, Pierce, Connolly, and the rest of them. Naturally enough, I would have been at the time about 18. I wondered what it was all about and what happened, and of course I got the British side of it. But what struck me first was the long drawn out time they took between executions, one day, two days afterwards, and so on. And that put me thinking. Of course, at that time I had no conception of Irish nationality, and I was brought up in a period of and school days I could name every king and queen of Britain or of England, but I knew nothing about any of our own past people, because it was definitely excluded from all schools, not alone the national schools, but a Jesuit college that I went to afterwards. In short, the whole country apparently at that period, without I thinking it was in any way extraordinary, was an accepted subject race of Britain.
Commandant General Thomas Barry, one of the most successful guerrilla leaders against the British that Ireland has ever produced. General Barry was a soldier in the British Army when he first heard that some of his compatriots had risen in rebellion in Dublin. It was Easter time in the year 1916.
Edmund Spenser, poet, in the year 1595. England will bring the Irish so low that he shall have no heart nor ability to endure his wretchedness, so pluck him on his knees that he will never be able to stand up again. English order issued from Dublin Castle to English soldiers in Ireland in the year 1642. Wound, kill, and destroy by all the ways and means you may all the Irish rebels, and burn, spoil, waste, consume, and demolish all places, towns, and houses, and all hay and corn there, and kill and destroy all the men inhabiting able to bear arms. Oliver Cromwell, Englishman in Ireland, before leaving in the year 1652. The enemy were about 3,000 strong in the town. I believe we put to the sword the whole number. Incidentally, the Irish enemy were comprised of men, women, and children, but they had one thing in common. They followed the Catholic faith. Oliver Cromwell concluded his dispatch, I wish that all honest hearts may give the glory of this to God alone, to whom indeed the praise of this mercy belongs. And then Oliver Cromwell sent thousands of Irish women and girls to the West Indies as slaves.
On April the 24th, 1916, Irish schoolteachers, Irish poets, Irish lawyers, and Irish trade unionists rose in armed rebellion against the British power in their country. The fighting centred around this General Post Office here in Dublin. This noble but suicidal Irish revolt became known as the Easter Rebellion. One of the Irish patriots fighting inside the post office was General Sweeney. He was, at that time, a student of engineering.
There were about a dozen of us, started off up Abbey Street, and when we were about halfway up Abbey Street, we heard the firing up in the Upper O'Connell Street, which was the attack from the post office on the Lancer unit that had come down the street.
British Lancers?
British Lancers, yeah. And eventually we got into the GPO and began the task there of filling mail bags full of coal, mainly dust from the basement, blocking up the windows, and generally getting ready for what was to come.
Yes, when I arrived at Jacob's factory on the Tuesday morning, it was surrounded by a howling mob, roaring at the volunteers inside to come out and get out to France and fight a lot of so-and-so slackers and all this sort of business. And I remember the first blood I ever saw shed was one big, very, very big, tall woman with something very heavy made a bang at me. And just as she lifted her weapon or whatever she had in her hand, one of the volunteers upstairs saw this and he fired. And I just remember seeing her face and he'd disappear. And she went down like a sack. So that was my first baptism of fire.
At that particular time, I was on the north-east side of the GPO, up on the roof, and I could see troops moving about freely in the tower of Amiens Street railway station. I reported down to central control below on the ground floor that these people were there and asked would they fire on them. I was told not to, because they were the Enniskillens and they might be friendly. Well,
an Irish regiment?
Well, a very short time after that, they indicated their feelings when they opened fire on me with a machine gun. So gradually the troops began to circle in, and on the Wednesday, I think it was, from the Rotunda here, the British had mounted howitzers in the back of the hospital grounds, and they began to lob incendiary shells on the GPO. So we dealt with them as best we could with the hoses available, and then the fire became more intense. They began to come oftener, and eventually they shut off the water supply. So we had to retreat from the top of the roof into the lower floor, and we barricaded a window overlooking the top of the street here. A young lad called Sammy Riley, who is now over in caretaker of Columbia University in New York, and myself, we were on sniper duty, and we stopped a lot of movement at the top of the street here, because when they saw the place on fire, they thought they could move in. And that night they brought an armoured car that they had built in Inchicore Railway Works around the corner of the then Great Britain Street, it was now Parnell Street, into O'Connell Street, and proceeded to clank on down towards us. So I said to Riley, you take the right aperture, I'll take the left. And we concentrated fire and stopped it. We must have killed the driver or injured somebody, because they stopped there, and eventually at night when all the lights were out, they came along and pulled it back where it came from.
Seán Harling was in the Easter Rebellion. He was 14 years old.
On the Friday, I think it was, I was going across to the Father Matthew Hall at Church Street Chapel when with a boy named Howard.
What were you going across there for?
With a dispatch for Pierce Beasley, who was a captain at that time. So when we were halfway across North King Street, Howard shouted, "Oh!" and I grabbed him as he was about to fall. So I pulled him onto the path and run down to the Father Matthew Hall for help, because it was quite close to me. And two volunteers came out with a stretcher, and we took Howard to the Richmond Hospital, quite close by, a 5 minutes walk. So when we got there, the doctor told us he was dead.
How old was he?
Same age as myself.
14?
14 at that time. So I came then to, my terrible task was, it was me that had to tell his mother.
Dr. Brigid Thornton was a schoolgirl, and she participated in the fighting.
Saturday morning, louder than all the noise was the silence that descended on the city. Everything seemed to flatten out and go quiet. And a few people came in and said a rumour of a surrender. And some of the soldiers, have you a hatchet, have you a hammer? Nobody's going to get my gun anyway, I won't, I'll die. And they began to look out the back to see was there any avenue of escape. You see, it was a little house with a little yard and stone wall outside it, very small area. And they hadn't uniform, you see. They were mostly in their civilian clothes. Some had a tunic and some had puttees and that sort of thing. And some of them gave me addresses and said, will you, when you get out, will you, if we've taken prisoner, will you call to my mother and call to son? I had a whole list of names. And someone gave me a gun and he said, will you keep my revolver? I said, I will. I had a big skirt that somebody had brought me with an enormous pocket on it. It was like one of these aprons the women in Moore Street used to wear with all the money and all the... So I put that in the pocket and kept it. And then towards evening, we did hear that we had surrendered.
And eventually somebody came to us and told us that Pearse had sent out an envoy to negotiate with the British. And about an hour and a half to 2 hours after that, we were all told to march out onto Moore Street. And we did this by going up to the top house. There's a laneway near that. It's now called O'Reilly Parade. And we got out into this laneway. And as we went out through the backyard of the house, Seán MacDiarmada, who was one of the leaders, addressed us. And he told us that this was only the beginning of the fight, that they would all the leaders would be executed. He said, but it's up to you men to carry it on. And we filed out onto Moore Street. We were lined up there in fours. We were marched right onto O'Connell Street. We were formed into 2 lines on each side of the street. We marched up to the front, left down all our arms and ammunition, went back to our original places on each side of the street, and officers with notebooks came along and took down our names.
British officers?
British officers. And a funny incident happened there. They came along past me and down about 3 files down, and the officer looked at a fellow, wrote down his name and walked on. So when he had gone a certain distance, one of the fellows said, does that officer know you? That's my brother, he says. So then when that formality was over, we were marched again into a little patch of green in front of the Rotunda Hospital, an oval patch. And we were all made to lie down there. And anybody who put his foot out on the gravel got a whack of a rifle butt or something else. And we were kept there the whole night, and a British officer during the night amused himself by taking out some of the leaders. He took out poor old Tom Clark and stripped him to the buff, and made all kinds of disparaging remarks about him. This old man has been at it before, he says, an old Fenian. He had a shop across the street there. And he took several others out, and that officer's name was Lee Wilson. He was subsequently shot in the town of Gorey, where he was a district inspector of the RIC. We were kept there for...
But the IRA shot him later.
Yes.
The leaders of that rebellion, today the honoured inspiration of Irish people, were shot in Kilmainham jail. Dr. Thornton was also held in that infamous prison.
Which was a dismal, dreary, frightening place to be put on a lovely summer evening. We went in and there were officers inside, and a terrible man with a lantern, like one of those things you see in a farmhouse long ago, going out to milk the cows. And he held it up, and they tried to take more details out, and somebody said, oh, take them up and throw them into the cells, we can't get anything. There was no light in it, you see. So this old fellow said, bring them down here before they go up to the cells. So he marched us down a corridor, a couple of corridors, and he held up the lantern and he said, read that. So we read out, sin no more, lest the worst thing come unto thee. It's into the drop you should be taken. I said, what's that? To hang the scaffold. Well, anyway, we protested and we said we didn't sin, and we were marched up the stairs and thrown 3 or 4 into a cell, but we didn't care where we got so long as we got lying down. We were lay on the floor, and we were very exhausted and very tired. But in the morning, I heard a terrible volley of shooting, and I asked the one who came into us, and to me, Miss McInerney, I said, what was all the shooting this morning? She said they were shooting some of the men. I didn't know who or what, and I didn't believe it. That day we were let out for about 10 minutes exercise, and we met a lot of other girls from who had been at other centres during the week. And I said to one of them, I heard they were shooting the men. She said, don't you worry, they're not going to shoot any of the men. They'll be too much afraid of America. Well, the next morning the shooting was on again and again and again. Every morning after that at about 5 o'clock, I could hear the men marching out. Once down by my cell door, and a heavy march, and out, and then the volleys. That was very frightening, but I was consoled by what this girl told me. And I asked Miss McInerney again. She said, yes, there were more shot this morning. Well, for months afterwards, I always woke at that hour, and I've never forgotten those volleys. Never.